Hello and welcome back to the Absolute Art Fundamentals, and today we are going over colour. Now in previous lessons, the idea of what the concept that we're talking about is can sometimes be in a little bit of dispute. Lines aren't just necessarily straight lines, forms aren't necessarily one thing or another, but with colour I think we've all got a pretty good idea of what colour is. Colour is simply things like your reds, your blues, your yellows. And I really don't need to go on beyond this, I think. I think we've all got a generally good idea of what colours are. So why do we cover them in fundamentals? Well, the real question is not so much what colours are, but how to use those colours in your art. And the way to look at this is what problems you may get when using colours, and how what you may think of being simply a case of just filling in the spaces with a particular colour that you choose may be more difficult than you realise. For example, let's say here, so we've got this nice blue background here that we've always used for these videos, but let's say I wanted to write something in there, but I didn't want to use the standard black. What colour would I use? Well, if I use another colour that's very similar to the blue, such as a light green, you may start noticing that it's okay, but this colour isn't the best. So you can kind of see that it's okay, it generally does the job, but it's a little washed. It's almost like they're far too similar to each other, like this light blue and this light green. So it's like if I wanted to use this as, say, like on a big signboard of any kind, having a light green against a light blue wouldn't be the best choice of colours. But if I was to use instead a light orange, we can see that this is actually pretty clear. It stands out, it's bold, and it contrasts well with the blue. So what's going on here? Well, the idea here is we've got what's known as complementary and comparative colours. So complementary can also be known as contrast, but they are colours that are essentially on the other side. So the best way to explain this, and you may be familiar with it already, is the colour wheel. And we're just going to quickly make a quick colour wheel here, just to show you what that's all about. A colour wheel usually works on three levels. The first level is the primary level, where we put three particular colours, and these colours are red, yellow, and blue. And this is the first part of the colour wheel, although it's more of a colour triangle at this point. And after that, we then have what's known as the secondary colours. Now, these are the colours that you get when you mix two of the primary colours together. So if you mix in red and blue, you get your purples. If you mix your red and your yellow, you get your oranges. And if you mix your yellows and your blues, you get your greens. I'm making this a triangle rather than a wheel, but bear with me. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what makes a primary colour and what makes a secondary colour? The answer is in the mixing. You can mix yellow and red to get orange. You can mix yellow and blue to get green. You can't mix green and orange to get yellow. It will end up in a more mucky state that won't be quite as pure as the original yellow. So the primary colours are essentially the base colours. You cannot make red out of other colours mixing together, but you can use red to make other colours. You then have your third line, and this is the tertiary line, which is a little bit more difficult to... This is kind of like the in-between the in-betweens. So for red, you may have like an orangey red, and for between yellow and orange, let's go for that. You have the orange-yellow, and this is literally what the tertiary colours are known as. They are known as, this would be red-orange, this would be orange-yellow. I just quickly filled these in. This is a yellow-green. This is a green-blue. They may sometimes have other names. There's a whole potential world of names out there. This does look a bit more like a turquoise, as you may notice. The purples and the blues mixed together. You'll often find a lot of these just end up being a bit more purpley. Can we make that there we go, that's a bit more bluish. And then back to between red and purple. And you end up with a red-purple. And this is the basic idea of the colour wheel. Let's sort this out so it's just a bit clearer quickly. And so here we have a bit of an easier to understand colour wheel, and it's with this that we can essentially tell what's a contrasting colour and what's a comparative colour. So as we saw from our example earlier, we had a blue background and we found that the orange was one of the ones that worked best, and we can kind of see here that there's a nice simple reason for that. They are opposite each other on the colour wheel. So in a similar route you may notice that the green contrasts nicely with the red, and the yellow contrasts nicely with the purple. And the simple rule of thumb here is that the colour is often on the opposite side of the colour wheel. A nice little idea that you can use for this if you don't want to have to look at the colour wheel each and every time is to consider which colour you're wanting to use. So let's say I have a red colour and I don't have the rest of the colour wheel. How do I use to figure it out? Well, the key to figuring out the complementary colour is to find out the opposite one on the wheel. So if it's a primary colour that you're using, it's going to be always a secondary colour. And that secondary colour is going to be the result of the two other primary colours. So if you have a red primary colour and you're wanting to know what the complementary is for that, you would think, okay, so the other two primary colours are yellow and blue, so therefore red's complementary colour must be green. And you can do this in reverse too. So if you start off with orange and you want to find out its complementary colour, well, you think, well, orange is made by mixing red and yellow together. And so, therefore, its complementary colour must be the primary colour not used to mix it, and so, therefore, it's blue. So coming back to the key idea of what colours do I use when I'm working on my art, you'll find the colours tend to come into two basic categories. There'll be the colours that you want to use together, and the colours that you want to use apart. So if we go back to our idea before of spacing that we saw in one of the previous lessons, we had the ideas of the positive space and the negative space. And let's say for your positive space, you're drawing a picture of, let's say, a fox, and you want to have that show up nicely against a particular landscape. So if we take the colours of a fox, we'll like orange, they would be around this area here. So we kind of know that fox is going to be an orangey brown colour. So we focus on here. The comparative colours for the fox will be the ones that are essentially closest to it on the colour wheel, so that we know that orange is mixed by red and yellow, so we can generally use this group here as its comparative colours. And the general rule of thumb is to basically, if you think of it, ignoring the tertiary colours for the moment, it's usually the secondary and primary colours that are right next to it. So, again, in a similar line for comparative colours, like the comparative colour for green would be yellow and blue. But you can also have the mix in between of the areas too. So the tertiary colours and essentially the colours that go off in between them for all the many different millions of variations. So let's say you're drawing an orange fox and you want to know what it will work good against. So your positive space will mostly involve the fox and its colours of orange and brown and yellow, and maybe a bit of red there too. So against that fox, the best backgrounds will be the blues and the greens, along with a bit of purples. Let's make another example. This one's more of a comparative example. Let's say you're drawing a particular landscape and you just want that landscape to all work nicely together. You don't really want anything particularly to stand out. You don't want there to be a particular subject which stands out. It's just simply a basic landscape of maybe a country field that you're painting. Well, the answer will essentially answer itself in that a lot of the colours that you're going to want to use are the comparative colours that would go with that scene of nature. So if it's a field, you can imagine it'll be mostly greens with a bit of yellows, and you may want that to bleed over into a nice pale blue sky. But what you wouldn't want to do is somewhere in the middle of that, particularly maybe have something that's extremely red standing out. So you could do, if you wanted, let's say you wanted to draw a red barn of some kind, you could have that sitting there and that would stand out. But if you wanted it all to work together without something like that getting in the way, you would try to avoid those types of colours. So from sticking to these two basic rules, you can get a usual idea of what your colour palette should be. And when you're starting off with colour palettes, I usually recommend that you keep them small and limited. It can be very easy, especially if you're using like a program like Photoshop where you have access to 16 million plus colours, to go overboard and use a little bit of one colour here, a little bit of another colour here. Often it's usually good to set up a particular palette. So you could simply say, these are the only colours I'm going to use, and make sure you never really deviate from them. What you really don't want to be doing is say, like, I'll be using this red, but I'm also going to be using this red, and I guess I'll also use this kind of red here, because after a while they'll start to bleed together and it can lead to a very washed out picture. So often a good rule of thumb in most mediums is to simply pick 5 colours that sort of work together. So you may have 3 comparative colours and 2 contrasting colours together. So you could say, have your red, have a bit of red, have a bit of orange, and then have the green, yellow, and blue. And then work these together. Now, 2 particular colours you may be noticing are missing here are white and black. And that's because these aren't really considered colours. These are essentially what are known as tones. So if you saw in the video on values, we really covered these here. And these are the two concepts that really start merging together. You may have a pure red, but you would also have like layers of white and black in there, overall changing it. So if we start with red here, we may add in just a bit of white to make it just a bit paler, and then a bit more white to make it even paler. And then just the tiniest amount of red is still left by the time it gets really pale. And on the flip side, we have the same thing with the levels of darkness. So we add in a bit more black, and eventually we get to the point where it's essentially pure black. So it becomes a very useful rule to stick with 5 or so base colours and just simply add in different levels of white and black, and maybe even mix them together for similar effects. For the last part of this primer on colours, and taking it really as a quick primer, colours can get very complex. You can go into like the emotions of colours, the warmth of colours. There's whole extra areas to cover here, and we may cover those in another video. But for the last part, what I want to draw your attention to is this picture here. Now, you may notice here, this is, anyone who's familiar, this is Optimus Prime from the Transformers franchise, and you generally remember Optimus Prime as being both red and blue, but what's important here is to notice that despite that, this picture of Prime doesn't particularly have any actual reds or blues. It sure looks like it does, but if we look closely, we'll actually see that we have purples, and even more purples. So this is kind of an important point. Colours aren't a hard rule to use. You can keep it simple. You can just simply use your bold reds and your bold blues if you're drawing a character like Prime. But when it comes to adding particular light sources or particular moods and emotions onto the picture, those colours can potentially change, and you can be flexible with them. The key is to stick to a constant colour palette. Don't draw one particular picture of him as pure red and blue and then choose to draw the next picture as purple, unless you plan to stick to that for a while. Otherwise it can feel that your colours are all over the place. So for today's exercise, I recommend you just play around with the colour wheel. So see what colours work well together, see what colours work against each other. See what red looks like against orange, and what orange looks like against purple. You may find some colours, even though that they're not directly contrasting colours, actually do work pretty well if you use one as the positive subject and one as the negative. Keep practicing and have fun. I'll see you in the next lesson.